back to the economic tragedies of the 1930s. But what we asked for on this programme last week was evidence that lessons had been learnt from that time, that at least some academic economists had forecast the present crisis, that somewhere in the thousands of academic journals were refereed articles with explicit warnings. What a response! So many names, but after reading every one, I still felt that my original cynicism was more or less justified, because you see, so many of the names on offer, they weren't strictly academic economists writing within their discipline. That was the declared object of our search. They were, well, social commentators, economic historians, sociologists, political scientists. But still, your emails of recommendation were fascinating to read. Special thanks to Kai-Shu Tai, who rehearsed the claims of Robert Brenner. There was Neil Evans on J.K. Galbraith, Keith Clark on John Maynard Keynes, Anthony Brown on the Soviet economist Kondratiev, Tony Beaumont on Buckminster Fuller, Simon Bourdion and Martin on Nassim Taleb. My sincere thanks to everyone else who took the time and trouble to write. In the end, though, it was a simple email from Barbara Humberstone, which most seemed to fit the bill. Dear Laurie, I thought I would draw attention to Professor Richard Dale, who apparently forecast the financial crisis years ago in his study, International Banking Deregulation, the Great Banking Experiment. But where in the world was Richard Dale? Well, we first discovered that he'd retired from his academic chair at Southampton University. We had no luck when we rang there. His publisher? No, still no good. Then we checked every Dale in the Southampton directory. Still no luck. And then, from an email inquiry, we learnt his wife's mobile number. Where is Professor Dale? We asked her. With me, she said. Walking in the Atlas Mountains. Well, where else? But I'm delighted to say that he's now descended several thousand feet to join me in the studio. Richard, as we're about to see, you predicted the present debacle with great accuracy. I wonder if that means that the present circumstances give you some sort of satisfaction?
Well, I suppose at the intellectual level it's nice to be proved that one wasn't totally wrong. But of course what's happening has very dire implications of lots of people around the world. So I don't think this is it's a very satisfying thing spectacle to view. So I think that Schadenfreude is heavily qualified.
Qualified Schadenfreude. Let's turn to your predictions. Here's an edited extract from your book. It's an extract in which you refer to securities, that is, an involvement with stocks and shares, derivatives and bonds. Here's what you wrote.
In the 1920s, US banks were becoming heavily involved in securities markets, as their traditional lending business showed signs of drying up. The entry of banks into the securities industry was followed in 1929 to 33 by the most dramatic banking collapse in financial history. Today, the same market pressure that propelled US banks into stock market business in the 1920s, namely the securitization of lending, is engulfing the banking industry worldwide. Banks' growing involvement in securities activities could have destabilizing consequences of the kind attributed to US bank securities affiliates in the 1920s and early 1930s. Put another way, can the mixing of banking and securities business be regulated in such a way as to avoid the danger of catastrophic destabilization of financial markets?
When did you write those words?
Well, the book was published in 1993, at a time when financial deregulation was the big craze around the world.
So you wrote, you wrote those all those years ago. And just tell me about the circumstances which prompted you to write the book at that time.
The circumstances were that financial centre after financial centre was deregulating its banks, allowing banks into areas where formerly they had not been allowed, removing activity constraints, you might say. And I thought to myself, well, hang on a second, do we know what we're doing here? This is a huge transformation in the world's financial markets, and financial markets have given us problems in the past. Perhaps we should take a look at it. And I took a look at it, and what I saw I didn't like, and based partly on the history of 1929-33, but a number of other factors as well.
And what was going on was the banks were really trying to step outside their traditional role.
They were doing so, and in order to ensure competitive equality, ensure that their banks didn't lose out, the next financial centre would follow suit and liberalise its banks.
And of course there was an act, a 1932 act, wasn't there? I think is it the Glass-Steagall Act?
The Glass-Steagall Act actually passed in 1933 in the United States, which separated banking, that's deposit taking, from investment banking, commercial banking from investment banking.
So this was a recognition. This act was a specific recognition of what had gone wrong in the early 30s.
It was a direct response to the banking crash of 2933. It was considered a piece of essential safeguarding legislation, widely acclaimed at the time, and that was in prospect. The prospect was that would be dismantled when I was writing my book, and it was indeed dismantled or repealed in 1999.
So this was a sort of denial of history in a way. I mean, the banks were saying, well, we want to get back into other business. We're not content with our traditional role. We want to get out into the wider world. We want to get out into stocks and shares. We want to get out into the market.
The banks were lobbying hard to have that legislation repealed. And that's indeed what happened, and it came into effect in 2000, and we're beginning to see now the consequences.
Now, who listened to you at the time? I wonder what the reaction to your book was. Do you recall some of the reviews, some of the reactions of fellow economists?
I think there was a very fair and interested review from the then Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, Sir Kit McMahon, and he did think that there was a serious risk involved here. But I think academic economists tended to think, well, the markets know best, and we've got past all this business of 1929-33, and what's more, there have been some revisionist histories which suggest that the securities business wasn't so directly implicated as people thought at the time, and it was considered a bit old-fashioned on my part to go harking back to that. And so the Journal of Finance, which is the prestige journal in the finance academic profession, gave a rather mixed review and certainly disagreed very strongly with my conclusions. So I don't think it gained me any brownie points in academia.
So there were people at the time who were saying, well, just a minute, the free market's out there. This was the beginning, I mean, we're talking about the 1990s. In 2000, it was the deregulation, further deregulation came in, wasn't it?
That's right.
And when that deregulation came in, what did it mean that banks could then do? Could you just tell me exactly what they could do that they couldn't do before?
Well, they could underwrite securities, they could buy securities, they could trade in securities, and they could distribute securities. They could get involved in those markets freely. And that's what they've done, because the securities markets have grown much faster than the conventional banking markets. So this has become their big business.
So they could really expose themselves to greater degrees of risk than
if they so chose. I mean, it's a behavioural issue as to whether they would do that. But my conclusion was that if the activity constraints were removed, the evidence was that they would use those increased powers to take on increased risk. And that is exactly what has happened.
Why do you think you were such a lone voice, a relatively lone voice in making this? Because, in a way, on the face of it, and I'm sorry to be so simple-minded about this, but here is an account of what occurred in the Great Depression. It's seen by many people at the time as directly relating to banks wanting to step outside the regulation and do business which wasn't their traditional business. We have an act which comes in to regulate, and then all of a sudden, the act's overthrown, the free market is restored.
I think there are intellectual fashions as well as market bubbles, and I think there was a huge intellectual fashion right up till today, particularly in North America, that markets knew best, and the financial market structure that emerged from a free market process would be better and more efficient and indeed sounder than a market structure that was determined by legislators and regulators. There was this huge faith in the ability of financial markets to conduct their affairs in a safe manner.
So economists who sat around at that time, who wrote papers together, who went to conferences together, and so they managed to ignore this, or they managed to somehow suggest that all was for the best in this best of all possible worlds?
Because of that basic supposition, there was a distinct lack of interest in financial market structure, and there is very little research into financial market structure. And just to give you one example, if anybody had been researching today into financial market structure, they might have noticed that banks were conducting huge businesses off their balance sheet, which were unregulated. These so-called structured investment vehicles, which have been a real source of instability. But no one's been doing this research.
So this was an area of economics which was rather neglected then?
Very much so.
And still is neglected?
I think so.
Any chance, do you think, that economists are going to be rather better in the future at paying attention to some of these structural deformities?
I think in the light of what has happened, that the research bodies will be very interested in this area, and there could be a stampede in this direction. But unfortunately, the stampede's happening after the event. But yes, I think there will be a big change. However, it is a difficult area because it's somewhat interdisciplinary. You need to have another string to your bow in a way. And the problem with the finance is that it has become very narrow, it's become slightly disengaged, it rather ignores the context, the behavioral context, the historical context, and the institutional context.
And the legal context, perhaps, because
when I say institutional, I mean also legal context.
Because you are interested in the law as well. So
Absolutely.
This leads you to look at acts which have occurred previously, which
Absolutely.
get ignored by.
The legal framework is critical.
Thank you, Richard Dale. Thank you very much, and well, congratulations on your forecast. I think I can say that.